The storm rolled in without warning, blanketing the remote Alaskan outpost in an impenetrable wall of snow. The research station, once bustling with the hum of scientific instruments and occasional laughter, now stood silent, its occupants huddled around a dwindling fire. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of tortured souls, rattling the old metal walls and clawing at the windows with icy fingers. Dr. Marcy Allen, the station's meteorologist, stared out into the swirling chaos. The weather reports hadn't predicted anything close to this. A freak storm, she told herself, a rare anomaly. But deep down, a gnawing unease had taken root. It wasn't just the storm. It was the tracks. Earlier that day, Marcy and the team had ventured out to secure their equipment against the incoming weather. That's when they found them. Deep, claw-like imprints in the snow, spaced too far apart to belong to any known animal. They started at the edge of the forest and trailed toward the station, only to vanish as suddenly as they appeared. No one had spoken about them since, but the unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. By midnight, the storm's fury had reached its peak. The outpost's generator sputtered and died, plunging the team into darkness. Panic flickered across the faces of the 7 researchers, their breaths visible in the rapidly dropping temperature. "I'll check the generator," said Dan, the station's mechanic. He grabbed a flashlight and thick parka, but his bravado did little to mask the fear in his voice. "Shouldn't take long." "Don't go alone," Marcy urged, but Dan shook his head. "Fewer bodies outside, fewer chances of frostbite," he replied. The door slammed shut behind him, and the others listened as his boots crunched through the snow, the sound fading quickly into the howling wind. Minutes passed, then an hour. Dan didn't return. The tension escalated. "We can't just sit here," muttered Sam, one of the biologists. "What if he's hurt? Or worse," Marcy said quietly. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Marcy and Sam volunteered to go after him while the others stayed behind. Stepping into the storm felt like walking into another world. The cold was biting, the wind carrying an otherworldly wail. They moved cautiously, the beam of their flashlights slicing through the swirling snow. The generator's shed was only 50 yards from the station, but it felt like miles. When they reached it, the door was ajar, snow piling inside. "Dan?" called, his voice swallowed by the storm. No answer. They stepped inside, their flashlight revealing a scene that stopped them cold. The generator sat silent, untouched, but smeared across the walls and floor was a chaotic spray of blood. No sign of Dan, just his flashlight, shattered and flickering weakly on the ground. "Back to the station," Marcy said, her voice trembling. They stumbled back through the snow, hearts pounding, only to find the door wide open and the remaining team members gone. "Hello?" Marcy called into the eerily silent station. No reply. The fire had gone out, and the temperature inside was as bitter as outside. On the walls, frost had crept into intricate patterns, almost like writing. "They wouldn't just leave," Sam whispered, his breath fogging the air. Then they heard it, a faint scratching sound from the far end of the hallway. It grew louder, more deliberate, echoing toward them. Sam grabbed a nearby wrench, holding it like a weapon. "Who's there?" he demanded. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then a low growl. Out of the darkness, something lunged. It was massive, a blur of white fur and impossible limbs, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Sam swung the wrench, but the creature was too fast. It knocked him aside like a rag doll, turning its gaze to Marcy. She ran. Her boots slid on the icy floor as she bolted into the storm, her breath coming in frantic gasps. Behind her, she could hear it giving chase, its growls mingling with the wind. She stumbled into the forest, the skeletal trees offering little protection. Marcy tripped, falling hard into the snow. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The creature loomed over her, its grotesque form illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning. Up close, its features were even more nightmarish, its jaws split unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a bone-chilling roar, and Marcy braced for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes fixed on something behind her. Marcy turned following its gaze and saw the tracks, the same clawed imprints they'd discovered earlier, now glowing faintly in the snow. The creature snarled, backing away, before vanishing into the storm. Marcy stumbled back to the outpost at dawn, her mind reeling. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness. Inside, the station was empty. No blood, no signs of struggle, just silence. The others were gone, their fates unknown. She radioed for rescue, but when help arrived days later, they found no evidence of her story. No tracks, no blood. Just a woman on the edge of madness, they're muttering about glowing footprints and a storm that shouldn't have existed. Years later, the outpost was abandoned, the storm written off as a freak weather event. But locals still whisper about the creature that roams the blizzards, its glowing eyes a warning to those who dare to venture too far into the cold. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the landscape in a grim, cold twilight. By the time the storm arrived, it was too late for the three hikers to turn back. The snow came down thick and fast, swallowing their footprints and erasing the trail behind them. "Just keep moving," Emily urged, her voice trembling. Her companions Mark and Hannah trudged silently behind her, their breath steaming in the frigid air. They had planned a weekend trek in Glacier Pines National Park, unaware that a deadly snowstorm was brewing. Now they were lost, the woods around them a maze of skeletal trees cloaked in ice. Mark stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he asked. The group froze, their breath hitching. At first, there was only the wind, screaming through the trees like a wailing banshee. Then, faintly, a sound emerged beneath it, a low, guttural growl. "Probably a wolf," Emily whispered, trying to convince herself more than the others. But something about the sound was off, deeper and more primal. "Wolves don't growl like that," Hannah said, her voice barely audible. Panic prickled at their spines. They picked up their pace, the cold biting harder with every step. Darkness fell quickly, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. The growling returned, closer this time, followed by the crunch of snow as if something massive was moving through the woods. "Run," Mark hissed. The three broke into a frantic sprint, their feet slipping on the icy ground. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Whatever was chasing them was fast, far faster than anything natural. They stumbled upon an old cabin, its weathered frame barely visible through the storm. Without hesitation, they burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The interior was as cold as the outside, the air thick with dust and decay. A single, rusted lantern sat on a table. Emily lit it, the weak flame casting flickering shadows on the warped wooden walls. "We'll wait it out here," she said, trying to steady her shaking hands. But the growling didn't stop. It circled the cabin, claws scratching at the walls, testing the old wood. "Do you think it'll get in?" Hannah whispered. Mark peered through a crack in the boarded window. "I don't know, but it's big, too big." The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. They held their breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of their own hearts. Then came a new sound, a soft knock at the door. "Hello?" A voice called from outside. It was a woman's voice, calm and warm. "Is someone in there? I'm lost." Emily's stomach twisted. "Who could be out here in this storm?" she whispered. "Maybe she's like us," Mark said, his voice hopeful but unsure. "No," Hannah said firmly. "No one survives out here alone. That's not a person." The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Please, I'm so cold. Let me in." The knocking grew louder, harder, until the entire door rattled on its hinges. The voice turned shrill, furious. "Let me in!" Emily grabbed a chair and jammed under the doorknob. "Whatever's out there, it's not human," she said, her voice cracking. The lantern flickered and dimmed. A foul smell seeped into the cabin like rotting meat. They heard the creak of footsteps on the roof. "It's above us?" Mark whispered, clutching a rusted fireplace poker like a weapon. A sudden, deafening crash shook the cabin as something slammed into the roof, splintering the wood. The three screamed, huddling together as the ceiling bowed inward. The lantern guttered out, plunging them into darkness. "Stay quiet," Emily hissed, though she could barely hear herself over the blood rushing in her ears. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a heavy thud landed behind them. The sound of something impossibly large breathing in the dark. Emily's shaking hand fumbled for a match, striking it against the box. The small flame flared to life, and for a split second, they saw it. The creature was towering, its body a grotesque mix of fur and exposed muscle. Its face was the worst, a distorted amalgamation of human and animal features, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. It smiled, revealing jagged teeth, and then the match went out. Screams filled the cabin as the creature lunged. Emily bolted for the door, yanking it open and tumbling into the snow. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The storm swallowed her, the cold burning her lungs as she ran. Behind her, the cabin's screams stopped abruptly, leaving only silence and the howling wind. When she finally collapsed in exhaustion, she realized she was utterly alone. The storm had erased every trace of the cabin, her friends, and even the creature. Emily was found days later by a rescue team, wandering aimlessly in the snow. She was frostbitten and delirious, muttering about a monster and a voice that begged to be let inside. When they searched the area, they found no cabin, no tracks, no evidence that anyone else had been there. But the rescuers spoke of a strange feeling in the woods, an oppressive cold that lingered long after the storm had passed. The bus shuddered to a stop, its headlights struggling to pierce the wall of falling snow. Cassidy rubbed her hands together, peering nervously out the frosted window. She was the only passenger left, and the driver turned to her with a grim expression. "This is the end of the line," he said, his voice low and wary. "You sure you want to get off here? There's nothing around for miles." Cassidy nodded, her breath fogging the glass. She'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, renting a remote cabin for some solitude. The idea seemed far less appealing now, with the storm raging and night closing in. The driver sighed and opened the door. A blast of icy wind whipped through the bus. Cassidy stepped off, clutching her bag, and watched as the bus disappeared into the storm, its taillights fading like dying embers. She was alone. The cabin was supposed to be a short walk from the drop-off point, but the snow had other plans. The path was buried, the landmarks she'd studied in photos unrecognizable in the swirling whiteout. She trudged forward, her boots crunching through the snow, the world eerily silent except for the wind. Then she heard it. A faint voice carried on the breeze. Cassidy. She froze, her heart pounding. It was impossible. No one knew she was here. She hadn't even told her family where she was going. Cassidy. The voice was closer now, whispering her name with an unnatural intimacy. She spun around, but the snow obscured everything beyond a few feet. Her breath quickened as she fumbled with her phone, only to find it dead. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and coming from all directions. She broke into a run, her bag bouncing against her side. The snow was deeper now, dragging at her legs, and the cold clawed through her jacket like icy fingers. She didn't see the cabin until she almost ran into it. Its dark silhouette loomed out of the storm, its windows black and lifeless. Relief flooded her as she stumbled onto the porch, her numb hands fumbling with the key the rental agency had sent her. The door creaked open, and she slammed it shut behind her, bolting it tightly. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the storm outside. She found a box of matches and lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The place was sparse but cozy, a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a single bed tucked into the corner. She tried to shake off the unease as she started a fire. The whispers had stopped, she told herself. She was safe now. But then she noticed something strange. The snow on the porch, it hadn't been disturbed. No footprints, no sign of her frantic approach. Her blood ran cold. A soft creak echoed from the corner of the room. She spun around, the candlelight flickering wildly. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, shapes moving where they shouldn't. Cassidy. The voice came again, but this time it was inside. Her heart thundered as she grabbed a fireplace poker, holding it in front of her like a weapon. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a shape, tall, gaunt, and wrong. Its face was featureless except for two deep black voids where eyes should have been. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, the voice sliding into her mind like a cold blade. Cassidy stumbled back, her legs hitting the bed. She swung the poker, but it passed through the figure like smoke. The creature tilted its head, as if amused, and stepped closer. "You brought the storm," it said. "You brought me," she screamed, throwing the poker at it and scrambling for the door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, but the knob wouldn't turn, the door frozen shut. Behind her, the creature whispered again, its voice now echoing in 100 tones. "No one leaves the storm, Cassidy, not without a price." The candles blew out. Darkness swallowed her. Days later, a rescue team found the cabin. It was intact but abandoned, the fireplace still smoldering. They found no footprints, no sign of Cassidy or anyone else. But they all agreed on one thing. The cold inside that cabin was unlike anything they'd ever felt, and they couldn't shake the sensation of being watched as they left. The storm ended that night, but locals swear they still hear whispers in the woods, calling a name on the wind. The train screeched as it came to a stop at the edge of a snow-covered forest. Clara shivered and glanced out the frosted window. The station was little more than a wooden platform buried under a thick layer of snow. She was the only passenger getting off, and the conductor gave her a strange look as she stepped into the biting wind. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice almost lost in the gusts. Clara nodded, clutching her scarf tightly. She'd come to this remote village to settle her late grandmother's affairs. The family home, abandoned for years, was just beyond the woods. She thanked the conductor and watched as the train disappeared into the distance, leaving her utterly alone. The path through the forest was narrow, the snow muffling her footsteps. The air was eerily still, the only sound the occasional crack of a distant branch. Clara tried to focus on the map in her hand, but the deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The trees all looked the same, their skeletal branches forming a labyrinth that seemed to shift and twist. Then she noticed something. The trees weren't just bare, they were scarred. Deep gouges marred the bark as though clawed by some massive creature. She stopped, her heart racing, and felt a growing unease settle over her. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a soft hum, almost like a melody. She turned, squinting through the swirling snow, but saw nothing. The humming grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was all around her. Clara quickened her pace, the eerie tune following her. She reached the clearing where the house stood, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the white landscape. Relief washed over her as she ran to the front door and pushed it open, stepping into the cold, musty interior. The house felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with a scent she couldn't place, like decayed wood and something metallic. She turned on her flashlight and swept it across the room. Dust covered the furniture and cobwebs stretched between the beams, but it wasn't the disrepair that unnerved her. It was the silence. Even with the wind howling outside, the house felt dead. As she moved through the rooms, she saw strange things. The mirrors were all cracked, as if someone had deliberately smashed them. Family photos were turned face down on the shelves. In the kitchen, the table was set for two, though no one had lived here in years. Then she heard it again, the humming. This time it was inside the house. Clara froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The humming stopped, replaced by a faint creak from the floor above. Against her better judgment, she climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under her weight. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward, as though the house itself were breathing. One door at the end was ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her. She pushed it open, revealing her grandmother's old bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, but the air was freezing, her breath clouding the flashlight's beam. On the bed lay an object she hadn't seen in years, a porcelain doll, its face cracked and its glass eyes staring blankly at her. Clara backed away, her unease turning to panic. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The humming returned, louder now, almost deafening, and the doll's head twisted toward her with a sickening crack. "Why did you come back?" a voice whispered, guttural and cold. Clara screamed, fumbling with the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. The humming swelled, the walls seeming to close in around her. She looked back at the doll, but it wasn't on the bed anymore. It was standing in the corner, its cracked face twisted into a grin. The last thing she saw before the flashlight flickered out was the doll moving toward her, its tiny porcelain hands reaching for her throat. When villagers found the house days later, the snow had buried most of it. Inside, they found no sign of Clara, just a single cracked porcelain doll sitting on the bed, its glass eyes staring out the window. They boarded up the house, warning outsiders to stay away. But on cold winter nights, they say you can still hear a faint humming drifting through the woods, calling lost travelers to their doom. The road stretched endlessly, blanketed by the relentless snowstorm. Darren gripped the steering wheel tightly, squinting at the faint glow of his headlights against the swirling white. The GPS had given up miles ago, and now his phone was dead. It wasn't supposed to snow this heavily. The forecast had called for light flurries, not a blizzard. He cursed under his breath. The last road sign had been half buried in snow, unreadable, and there hadn't been another car or sign of life for hours. His gas gauge dipped perilously close to empty. He needed to find shelter, and soon. Then, like a mirage in the storm, Darren saw it. a dim light flickering in the distance. He let out a breath of relief and turned onto a narrow, snow-covered path leading to what appeared to be a house. As he approached, the outline of a large, weathered mansion emerged. Its windows were dark except for one where the faint glow of a candle danced behind the glass. He parked, grabbing his coat and flashlight, and trudged through the snow. The wind howled around him, and the icy flakes stung his face, but he pushed forward. Reaching the door, he knocked hard. The sound echoed through the house, but there was no response. "Hello?" Darren called, his voice muffled by the storm. Still nothing. The front door creaked open slightly, as if inviting him in. He hesitated, but the cold was unbearable, and he had little choice. Inside, the air was dry and stale. The house was massive, its high ceilings and ornate woodwork speaking of old wealth, though everything was cloaked in a thick layer of dust. The candlelight came from a single room down the hall, and Darren moved cautiously toward it. The room was a study, lined with shelves of ancient crumbling books. A single candle burned on a desk, its wax pooling around the base. Papers were scattered across the surface, covered in writing so faded it was illegible. But the most disturbing thing was the chair behind the desk. It was turned away from him, but he could see the edge of what looked like a hand resting on the armrest. "Hello?" Darren tried again, his voice trembling. The chair didn't move. Darren approached slowly, the floor creaking under his boots. His flashlight beam flickered over the back of the chair, illuminating more details. The hand was pale, almost gray, and unnaturally still. He reached out, hesitated, and then spun the chair around. It was empty. Darren stumbled back, his pulse racing. The hand he thought he'd seen was gone, replaced by a simple strip of fabric draped over the armrest. The candle flickered, the flame dimming, and the room seemed to grow colder. Something shifted behind him. A faint sound, like breathing, came from the hallway. He turned, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but empty space. "I need to leave," he muttered to himself, backing out of the study. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the house. Darren jumped, nearly dropping his flashlight. He turned toward the front door, but the hallway stretched unnaturally, the exit now impossibly far away. The air grew heavier, pressing against him, and the faint sound of whispers began to rise. They were low at first, unintelligible, but as they grew louder, Darren could make out fragments. "Don't leave. Stay with us." A cold draft swept through the hall, extinguishing his flashlight. Darren fumbled with it, his hands trembling, but the light wouldn't return. He spun in the pitch black, trying to orient himself. Then he felt it. A hand, cold and skeletal, gripped his shoulder. He screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, and the floor beneath him began to feel unstable, as though it were shifting and warping. He ran blindly, his hands outstretched to find the walls. Finally, he reached a door. He shoved it open and slammed it shut behind him, leaning against it as his chest heaved. The room was small, with a single boarded-up window. In the center stood a large mirror, its glass cracked and fogged with age. Darren approached it cautiously, his breath visible in the freezing air. As he drew closer, he noticed his reflection didn't match his movements. When he stopped, the reflection didn't. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "Welcome home," it whispered. The mirror's glass exploded outward, and darkness consumed him. When the storm cleared the next day, a passing motorist found Darren's car abandoned on the side of the road. The mansion didn't exist. There was nothing but an empty field where it should have stood. But the motorists swore they heard whispers in the wind as they drove past, faint and chilling. "Stay with us." The storm had been raging for hours when Leah's car skidded off the icy road and slammed into a snowbank. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She cursed her decision to take the back roads, thinking they'd be quicker. Her phone had no signal, and the cold was creeping into the car like a living thing. Through the blizzard, she spotted it, a faint light glowing in the distance. It was hard to tell what it was, but it was her only hope. Wrapping herself in her coat, she stepped out into the bitter wind and started trudging toward the light. Each step was a battle against the snow that clung to her legs and pulled her down. As she got closer, the light resolved into the flickering lantern of a small building, a gas station, or what had once been one. The sign was faded, the windows dark, and the pumps rusted relics of another time. But the light was real, coming from a lantern hanging above the door. She pushed inside, grateful to be out of the storm. The air inside was heavy, stagnant, and colder than she expected. The shelves were bare, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. The place looked abandoned, except for the lantern, which now sat on the counter. It hadn't been there a moment ago. "Hello?" Leah called, her voice trembling. It echoed unnaturally, as if the room were much larger than it seemed. No one answered. She moved toward the counter, her boots crunching on debris scattered across the floor. Her breath fogged in the air as she examined the lantern. Its flame burned steadily despite the lack of fuel. A faint sound came from the back room, a soft thump like something falling to the floor. Leah's heart raced. "Is someone there?" she asked, inching toward the door. The thumping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. She hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before slowly pushing it open. The room beyond was pitch black. Her flashlight, barely functioning, revealed a narrow staircase leading down into the earth. "Of course it's a basement," she muttered, her fear twisting into frustration. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being drawn forward, as if the darkness itself was pulling her in. She descended the stairs slowly, the steps groaning under her weight. The thumping grew louder as she went deeper. At the bottom, the air was damp and suffocating, and the smell of wet earth and something metallic filled her nostrils. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the room. It was a storage area, boxes and tools piled haphazardly, but in the center was something that didn't belong. A table, its surface stained dark and surrounded by chains bolted to the floor. The thumping stopped the moment her light hit it. Then, she heard breathing. It wasn't hers. The flashlight beam shook as she turned it toward the corner of the room. A figure stood there, hunched and unnatural, its back to her. Its body was wrapped in tattered fabric, and its limbs were too long, bending at angles that made her stomach churn. "Hello?" she whispered, though she immediately regretted it. The figure straightened, its movements jerky, as if it were a puppet on strings. Slowly, it turned to face her. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Leah screamed, scrambling back up the stairs, but the door at the top slammed shut before she could reach it. Something heavy followed her, its movements slow but deliberate. She banged on the door, shouting for help, but all she heard was the sound of the thing dragging itself closer. The lantern's glow appeared at the top of the stairs, casting just enough light for her to see the figure below. Its face, or what passed for one, was a pale, featureless mass. Its hands, impossibly large and clawed, reached for her, and it whispered in a voice that didn't belong in this world. "Stay with me." Leah shoved the door open with a burst of adrenaline and stumbled into the gas station. She grabbed the lantern, hoping the light would protect her, but the moment she touched it, the flame went out. The whispers filled the room, echoing from every direction. The shadows around her moved, closing in. The last thing she saw was the front door swinging open, revealing the blizzard outside and something impossibly tall waiting in the snow. When the storm cleared, the gas station was gone. No one in the nearby towns remembered it ever existing. Leah's car was found on the side of the road, the driver's seat covered in frost as if she'd never left it. Travelers who pass through the area sometimes report seeing a flickering light in the distance, but none who follow it are ever seen again. The cabin sat deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road. Sam and his friends had rented it for a winter getaway, lured by promises of pristine snow, isolation, and adventure. The storm wasn't supposed to come until late in the week, but by their second night it had arrived with a vengeance, burying the landscape in snow and cutting off their power. They laughed at first, lighting candles and joking about roughing it like pioneers. The cold crept in fast, though, and the novelty wore off. By midnight, the howling wind outside drowned out their conversation, and the flickering candlelight cast uneasy shadows on the cabin's old wooden walls. "I'm telling you, there's someone out there," Jake said, his breath fogging the air. He'd been pacing by the window for the last hour, swearing he saw movement in the trees. "It's just the wind," Lena replied, pulling her blanket tighter around her. "Or an animal. We're in the middle of nowhere." But Sam wasn't so sure. He'd heard the sound too, faint at first but growing louder. A tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was knocking on the walls of the cabin. They all froze when it came again. 3 knocks, then silence. Jake grabbed the flashlight and headed for the door. "I'm checking it out." "Don't," Lena hissed. What if? Jake didn't wait. He swung the door open and stepped out into the storm, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. Sam and Lena crowded behind him, staring into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind, their branches groaning under the weight of snow. See? Jake said, turning back toward them. Nothings. The words died in his throat as a figure appeared at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the pale light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but something about it was deeply, horribly wrong. Get inside, Sam whispered, his heart pounding. Jake hesitated, shining the flashlight directly at the figure. The light seemed to warp around it like it didn't fully exist. Then the figure took a single, jerky step forward. Jake bolted inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. What the hell was that? He shouted, his voice shaking. No one answered. The three of them stood in silence, the wind screaming outside. Sam tried to steady his breathing, but then he heard it again, the knocking. This time it came from the roof. Impossible, Lena whispered, her face pale. The knocks moved, circling overhead. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. The wood groaned under their weight. Attic, Sam said, his stomach sinking. There's an attic. Jake grabbed a fire poker and pointed toward the ceiling hatch in the corner of the room. If something's up there, we need to deal with it. Are you insane? Lena hissed. We wait. Whatever it is, it'll leave. But the footsteps didn't leave. They grew louder, heavier, until it sounded like whatever was up there was pacing directly above them. Sam couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed the flashlight from Jake and climbed onto a chair beneath the attic hatch. His hands trembled as he reached up and pulled the cord. The hatch creaked open and a ladder unfolded down to him. The air that spilled out was freezing, colder than the storm outside. Sam hesitated, then shone the flashlight into the attic. At first, all he saw was darkness. Then slowly the beam illuminated a corner. Boxes, a broken chair, a pile of old clothes, and then eyes. They glinted in the light, too many of them staring at him from the shadows. A face emerged, pale and stretched impossibly thin, its mouth splitting into a smile that revealed rows of jagged teeth. Sam fell backward, crashing to the floor. The hatch slammed shut on its own, and the sound of laughter echoed through the cabin. Not human laughter, something warped and animalistic. What did you see? Lena cried, pulling him to his feet. We have to leave, Sam choked out. Now. They didn't have time. The lights went out, candles, flashlight, everything. Darkness enveloped them. The laughter grew louder, coming from everywhere at once. And then the knocking started again. This time it came from the walls, the windows, the floor beneath their feet. Something scraped against the glass, and Lena screamed. The last thing Sam heard before the darkness swallowed him completely was a voice, low and guttural, whispering from the attic. You shouldn't have looked. When the storm cleared, the cabin was found buried in snow. Inside, the furniture was untouched, but no trace of Sam, Jake, or Lena remained. Locals say the forest around the cabin is cursed, and on quiet winter nights, you can still hear knocking coming from the trees. Those brave enough to approach swear they see figures moving just beyond the edge of the light, their pale faces grinning through the snow. The ski lodge had been abandoned for decades, its once luxurious facade now decayed and crumbling under the relentless weight of countless winters. Ella and her friends stumbled upon it while hiking through the snow-covered mountains. Their cabin was still hours away, and the blizzard closing in left them little choice but to seek shelter inside. Just for the night, Ella said as they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the hinges groaning in protest. It's better than freezing out here. The lobby was enormous, with high ceilings and a grand chandelier hanging precariously from rusted chains. The furniture was covered in dust, and the fireplace held the remnants of a fire long extinguished. Still, it was dry, and the walls shielded them from the howling wind. This place gives me the creeps, Max muttered, shining his flashlight across faded paintings on the walls. They depicted snowy landscapes and smiling guests frozen in time, their faces unnervingly lifelike. It's just old, Leah said, though her voice wavered. We'll be fine. They gathered in the main lounge, lighting a few candles they had packed. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind rattling the windows like an impatient guest demanding entry. They talked to pass the time, trying to ignore the eerie silence of the lodge, but soon the fatigue of their hike set in. Ella volunteered to explore for firewood, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows as she ventured deeper into the lodge. The halls were unsettlingly quiet, the carpet muffling her footsteps. As she passed a mirror, she thought she saw movement behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing there. In the dining hall, she found a stack of broken chairs and splintered wood. She began gathering pieces, but as she worked, she became aware of a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the soft scrape of footsteps on the floor above her. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. No answer. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing directly above her. They stopped abruptly, and for a moment all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Then, the chandelier in the main hall rattled violently as though something massive had brushed past it. Ella dropped the wood and ran back to her friends. "You hear that?" she asked, breathless. Max and Leah looked at her, their expressions uneasy. "We thought we heard something," Max admitted. "Like laughter." "It was footsteps," Ella said, her voice low. "Something's up there." They decided to stick together, huddling near the fireplace in an attempt to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. But the strange noises continued, whispers too faint to make out, a low creak like someone shifting their weight on loose floorboards. At some point, Leah gasped, "Did you see that?" "See what?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She pointed to the far end of the room. There was someone standing there. Max swept his flashlight across the area, revealing only dust and peeling wallpaper. "There's nothing." "There was," Leah insisted, her eyes wide. "A woman. She was staring at us." The words sent a chill through the group. Ella felt it too, a growing sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking their every move. She looked toward the paintings on the walls. The figures seemed different. Their eyes, once fixed elsewhere, now seemed to follow them. "We're leaving," Ella said firmly. "Storm or not, we're not staying here." But when they opened the front doors, the blizzard had worsened, the wind and snow forming an impenetrable wall. They were trapped. Defeated, they returned to the lounge. The fire had gone out, leaving the room dark and cold. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them. And then the chandelier crashed to the floor with a deafening explosion of glass and metal. In the chaos, they heard the laughter again, low and mocking, coming from every direction. When the flashlight beams steadied, they revealed the source of the sound, footprints in the dust leading toward the staircase. The three of them froze as a figure emerged at the top of the stairs. It was the woman Leah had described, her face pale and featureless, her body shrouded in tattered, frozen clothing. She didn't move, but raised one hand, her finger pointing directly at them. "Run!" Ella screamed, and they bolted toward the back of the lodge. They found themselves in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of rot. The doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The lights flickered to life for a brief moment, revealing dozens of figures standing in the corners of the room, their eyes black pits, their faces twisted into expressions of rage. The lights went out again and the whispers turned into screams. The search party found the lodge days later, but there was no sign of Ella, Max, or Leah. Their footprints stopped abruptly at the entrance, as though they had vanished into thin air. Inside, everything was as it had been for decades, except for the paintings. The new ones showed three figures, frozen in terror, their faces lifelike and familiar. On quiet winter nights, some say they can still hear faint screams coming from the lodge, carried on the wind like a warning to stay far away. The blizzard came faster than anyone expected. Mia had barely made it to her family's old cabin before the storm swallowed the world in a suffocating white haze. The cabin had been unused for years, left to rot in the middle of the remote woods, but it was sturdy enough to keep the storm at bay. Or so she thought. She set about lighting the fireplace, warming her frozen hands as the wind howled outside. The windows rattled in their frames, and every creak of the wooden beams felt like a groan of protest. Mia tried to ignore the sense of unease gnawing at her, chalking it up to exhaustion and isolation. Then, as she unpacked her supplies, she noticed something strange. A footprint. It was faint, almost erased by time, but it stood out clearly on the dusty wooden floor. It was larger than hers, wide and oddly shaped, like a barefoot impression left by something inhuman. Her heart raced as she crouched to examine it. The snow outside meant no one else could have gotten here. No one human, at least. But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. She shook her head and convinced herself it was an old mark. Nothing to worry about. The night deepened, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. As Mia sat by the fire, she heard it for the first time, a faint scratching at the window. She froze, her breath caught in her chest. The sound was subtle, like branches brushing the glass. But when she looked, she saw no trees near the cabin, just an endless expanse of snow. She crept to the window and peered out into the storm. The swirling snow obscured everything, but for a brief moment she thought she saw something move. Tall, thin, and unnaturally fast. It disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only the blizzard's howl. Mia backed away, trying to calm herself. "It's just the wind," she muttered. "Just the wind." Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap on the front door. Mia stared at it, her pulse thundering in her ears. No one could be out there. No one could survive in this storm. She grabbed a fireplace poker and edged toward the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Another knock, firmer this time. Mia's hand hovered over the doorknob. Against her better judgment, she flung the door open, bracing herself for whatever was on the other side. Nothing. The snow swirled in, biting at her exposed skin, but there was no one there. She slammed the door shut, bolting it tightly, and retreated to the fire. She told herself it was a trick of the storm, but deep down she didn't believe it. The cabin grew colder, the fire barely keeping the chill at bay. Mia tried to distract herself, but the scratching returned, this time from the roof. She stared upward, her skin prickling as the sound moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate. Her phone was useless, no signal, no chance of help. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. Then she heard it, the creak of the attic hatch above her. Maya's eyes darted to the small square door in the ceiling. The latch was still closed, but it swayed slightly as if something was pressing against it from the other side. Her grip tightened on the poker, her knuckles white. The hatch burst open with a deafening crash, and Mia screamed, stumbling backward. Dust and debris rained down, but the opening above revealed nothing but darkness. She stood frozen, her breath hitching as she waited for something, anything, to emerge. A hand reached down. It was impossibly long, pale and bony, with fingers that stretched too far. It gripped the edge of the hatch and began pulling a figure into view. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes black and empty, and its mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for its face. Mia bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. Behind her, the thing dropped to the floor with a sickening thud. She didn't dare look back as she flung the door open and ran into the storm. The cold was unbearable, the snow blinding, but she kept running, her feet sinking into the drifts. The wind roared in her ears, and her vision blurred, but she could still hear it behind her. The crunch of snow, the laughter, low and guttural, growing closer. She tripped and fell, the snow swallowing her whole. As she struggled to her feet, she saw it ahead. The cabin. Somehow, impossibly, she had circled back. The door stood open, warm light spilling out, and in the doorway stood the figure, its head cocked in mock curiosity, as if it were waiting for her. Mia's screams were lost to the storm. When the blizzard cleared, the cabin was found empty, its interior undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading from the attic to the front door. Locals say the storm that night was unlike anything they'd ever seen, and some claim that if you stand outside the cabin in winter, you can still hear faint knocking on the door, or the sound of something pacing in the attic. The wind clawed at Alex's face as she trudged through the snow, her flashlight beam barely cutting through the blizzard. She cursed her car for breaking down miles from civilization and herself for deciding to take the shortcut through the mountain pass. Night had fallen quickly, and the cold was biting deeper with every passing second. Just as her hope began to waver, she saw it. A cabin, its windows glowing faintly with warm golden light. Relief surged through her, and she pushed toward it, her boots crunching through the snow. Reaching the door, she knocked, her frozen knuckles barely making a sound. The door swung open on its own. "Hello?" Alex called, stepping inside. The warmth hit her immediately, and she sighed in relief. The interior was rustic but well kept. A roaring fire in the stone hearth, a table set for two, and a rocking chair swaying gently by the fire. She glanced around. Anyone here? No answer. The storm outside intensified, snow whipping against the windows. Alex shut the door behind her and moved closer to the fire, letting the heat seep into her frozen limbs. She'd thank the cabin's owner when they returned and explain her predicament. Her eyes fell on the table. The food, bread, stew, and a steaming mug of tea, looked fresh. Too fresh. It was as though someone had just been there, moments before she arrived. A faint chill crept up her spine. The rocking chair creaked. It stopped, then started again, moving ever so slightly despite the absence of anyone nearby. Alex frowned. "Hello? Is someone here?" Silence. She scanned the room and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a mirror hanging above the fireplace. It was old and tarnished, its frame intricately carved with what looked like strange symbols. As she moved closer, she saw her reflection, or what should have been her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked like her, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her smile stretched unnaturally, and her movements didn't match Alex's. The woman tilted her head, studying Alex with an unsettling intensity. Then she raised her hand and pointed behind Alex. Alex spun around, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the mirror. The woman was gone. She stumbled back, her breathing ragged. The fire in the hearth dimmed, and the once cozy warmth of the cabin turned icy cold. The light from her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The sound of footsteps echoed from above. "Who's there?" "Huck's there," Alex shouted, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps grew louder, moving across the ceiling, heading toward the stairs at the far end of the room. The first step creaked, then the second. Alex backed away, her eyes locked on the staircase as a figure emerged. It was a man, but his face was blank, no features, just smooth, pale skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring each step. She stumbled toward the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. When she finally wrenched it open, the storm blasted her with a wave of freezing wind. She ran, her feet slipping on the icy ground, the snow blinding her. Behind her, she heard the sound of the door creaking open again, followed by the crunch of footsteps. She didn't look back. After what felt like hours, she reached the road. Her car was still there, half buried in snow, but she didn't stop running until she reached it. She climbed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her breath fogged the windows as she tried to start the engine. It didn't budge. She glanced out the windshield, desperate for any sign of help. In the distance, through the swirling snow, she saw the faint glow of the cabin's windows. But then the lights went out one by one until only darkness remained. Her rearview mirror fogged up, and as she wiped it, she froze. The reflection showed the back seat of her car, where the faceless man sat, perfectly still, his head tilted ever so slightly toward her. The last thing Alex saw was her flashlight rolling onto the floor as the windows frosted over, sealing the car in ice. The car was found days later, abandoned and covered in snow. No sign of Alex was ever discovered, but locals whisper about the cabin in the storm, a place that appears only to those who are lost, offering shelter before taking them somewhere they can never return from. And if you see a light in the woods during a snowstorm, they warn, don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't look in the mirror.